Hello everyone. With this episode, we start game theory. Game theory studies strategic interactions. We develop formal and theoretical mathematical frameworks to describe strategic environments and then analyze them, again formally. What is strategic interaction? As the name suggests, interaction, it basically needs to include at least two separate entity, decision maker. Not just one, but at least two decision maker. Well, what is the strategic side of it? Well, it is strategic because when one party makes a decision, it affects its well-being, utility, but it also affects the other party's well-being and utility. All right, so that is the strategic interaction. Let's think of some examples. If you are a consumer in a perfectly competitive market, you know what perfectly competitive market is, right? There are many buyers, many sellers, and each buyer and seller are very tiny units in this market, so their behavior has no influence on the market price and market outcome. All right, so as a consumer, you can't say I am demanding this many product and so that's going to increase up the price and so it's going to negatively affect the other consumers. This is not possible in a perfectly competitive market. Okay, so in a perfectly competitive market, we usually take each individual as a single person, and so we basically solve a single person decision problem. So when he chooses what to consume, we basically maximize his objective function subject to the market prices and the income of this consumer. We basically ignore how the other consumers will behave because we assume there's no strategic interaction between these agents. As I said, that assumption basically comes from the idea of a perfectly competitive market where if the other guys consume too much, they cannot drive up the price. And so therefore, directly or indirectly, they're not going to affect my well-being. And so I can basically isolate myself from everybody else and just sort of focus on my objective function and solve it. However, in many environments, that's not possible. When I take an action, I cannot isolate myself because the consequences of my action is going to influence, sort of impact, in a good way or bad way, the other people around me, the other people in the same market environment or in the same institution, so depending on the context. So for example, if we are talking about cell phone producers like Apple, Samsung, there are very few producers in the market. The market is the world market, let's assume. And so one producer's decision definitely influence the market behavior, like how the consumers behave, what the price will be, etc., etc. And so therefore, Apple's decision is going to influence directly or indirectly Samsung's profitability. And so therefore, this is a strategic interaction. So when Apple makes a decision of when to release new cell phone or when to or what type of cell phone to produce in next month or next year, well, all these decisions are going to affect, again, all the players in this market. And so the Apple cannot isolate himself and so make that decision as a single person decision problem that we sort of get used to doing again and again in intermediate or advanced micro or macro courses. All right, so this is the strategic interaction. I hope it is clear, but as we go through with different examples, the concept is definitely going to be clearer. So what I would like to do is I would like to start with describing the strategic interaction or game. So for the rest of this course, I'm not going to call it again strategic interaction. Instead, a shorter version, I'm going to call it a game. All right, so a strategic interaction or a game must have those five parts, and we have to be specific about these five ingredients. So what is it? Well, first, set of players. So we should be specific about who the players are, how many players we have, and so on. All right? Second, well, we should be specific about what type of moves those players have or actions. All right? Later, we are going to define the concept of strategy, but don't forget, strategy and action are not the same thing in general. And then third, we need to be specific about what players know when they act, when they make a decision, when they choose an action. What do they know? So we call it information, all right? And then four, how the players' choices, actions lead to outcomes, all right? So first, what are the outcomes? And second, how the actions lead to those outcomes. So we need to be specific about these as well. And then the fifth and the final one is the preferences. So how do the players prefer or rank the outcomes, all right? Which outcome is favorite for which player, all right? So we need to know this information to be able to analyze it formally. All right, so for the rest of the course, we will actually boil it all this down into three things. I'm going to say players, actions, and then the payoff structure. So the payoff structure is definitely going to give me the outcomes and the preferences. And the information, I'm not ignoring it, but the thing is, I will always give the structure of the game to you, so therefore you will know what the information the players have when they choose an action. All right, so we start our analysis with, not the analysis actually, in my first few episodes, I'm going to describe the game theory and or describe the basics of the game theory. And so here we are basically describing it, not starting to, analyze it. So we're going to start description with extensive form games, all right? So I'm gonna do it with an example. So let's suppose there's a guy, Mr. Brown, all right? So Mr. Brown has some cash and he would like to make an investment. He would like to open a new restaurant, okay? Well, obviously he can just take this money, put it into a bank or some hedge fund, and then just enjoy the profit he's going to get for the rest of his life, right? So he doesn't really have to open a restaurant. He does have an outside option. Okay, so, but if he decides to put the money on hedge fund or sort of an interest, well, it's just a decision and that's it, right? The strategic interaction is just dies there. There's no further strategic playing going on if he's choosing this action. However, if he decides to open a restaurant, well, let's suppose there's another layer of decision he needs to make, which is where to open the restaurant. All right. So let's suppose there are two locations. Oh, first, let's suppose he has two available actions, right? The hedge fund versus opening a restaurant. And then the second layer of decision he needs to make, if he decides to open a restaurant, well, there are two locations, so he needs to choose the location for his restaurant. Obviously, opening a restaurant is more complicated decision-making process than this. I am clearly simplifying things out just to make a point. So one of the locations is, let's say, Toronto downtown. And then the other one is, well, Richmond Hill. So it's a suburb area. All right? Well, he has have an idea where exactly in Toronto downtown or Richmond Hill he wants to open his restaurant. But the thing is, it's not about really exact location, but sort of when he decides to choose one of those places, the competition is going to be the competition and the profitability he will be facing is going to be different. So let's suppose, to make things more interesting, obviously, and so here up until this point, there was no key elements for strategic interaction, right? There's no other decision maker here. At least we didn't introduce it. So it is the point now. So let's suppose when Mr. Brown decides to open a restaurant, or not, the hedge fund, or sort of invest his money on hedge fund, well, he knows that he has a sort of a competitor, all right? Mr. Green, let's suppose, also has an intention to open a restaurant, all right? So they know each other, they're colleagues maybe, they already are operating some restaurants here and there. And so Mr. Brown heard that Mr. Green is also willing to open a restaurant. And again, he also is thinking of opening a restaurant in Toronto downtown versus Richmond Hill. I mean, you may imagine is like, aren't there any other locations in this huge city? Well, obviously there are, but let's suppose for simplicity, there are these two options available, right? Toronto downtown, Richmond Hill. And so these two fellows are actually planning to open a restaurant in one of those locations. Okay, so, well, the thing is, can Mr. Brown say, you know what, screw Mr. Green, I'm going to open my restaurant wherever I want without thinking of what he is going to do? Well, he may or may not, well, depending on the level of strategic interaction, right? I mean, maybe Mr. Brown is planning to open a sushi restaurant and Mr. Green is opening an Italian restaurant. So the competition is not really there, right? One is serving completely different kinds of dishes than the other. And so it's not really, I mean, yes, there is still a competition, right? But the thing is, you know, if you feel like having a sushi tonight, you're not going to say, I'm going to go with Mr. Green because he's also serving a sushi. No, he's not. He's opening an Italian restaurant. All right. So let's make things more sort of competitive in a sense. So let's suppose both Mr. Brown and Mr. Green are actually willing to open a same style of restaurant, Italian restaurant, let's say. All right. So the environment is going to be very similar. The concept is going to be very similar. The foods are going to be very similar, etc., etc. And so the competition is very fierce. What does that mean? That means if they both open a restaurant in the same location, they will probably kill each other in a sense. It's like they're going to split the customers, obviously. But if one opens up in one place, let's say Toronto downtown, and the other opens the restaurant in a Richmond Hill, let's suppose, by the way, in these locations there is no other Italian restaurant, okay? Just to make the example sort of more striking, right? So that means, you know, opening a restaurant in different locations is actually a good strategy because, we don't really have to compete with each other because, you know, if you open a restaurant in Richmond Hill, you will be serving people in the suburbs and they will not come to Toronto downtown just to eat an Italian food, right? They're going to go to Mr. Green's restaurant. And so the people living in downtown will prefer Mr. Brown's restaurant because they probably do not want to drive 30 minutes, 40 minutes to Richmond Hill to eat that Italian food. So separate locations is a good thing. But the problem is Toronto downtown is a denser environment, right? And so there are more potential consumers there. And hence, opening a restaurant in Toronto downtown is more profitable. It's a better business. Richmond Hill, however, well, it's a suburb, right? People usually cook or they already eat in downtown and then drive back to their houses, or they take out from, I don't know, anywhere else. So maybe they're not so picky. The thing is, my point is, Richmond Hill is not that profitable location. So the question is, how are they going to coordinate where to locate the restaurant, right? So I believe you got the picture, but if this is the strategic interaction that we are analyzing from the point of Mr. Brown or Mr. Green, but as a game theorist, we usually try to model it from the point of view of a neutral party, all right? So how do we sort of formalize it? Well, let's come back to our sort of ingredients and check if we have all these ingredients. Players. Well, yes, the players are there. There are two players, Mr. Brown, Mr. Green. Remember, for simplicity, I ignored all the other restaurant owners. All right, so these are the two players. Very good. So I needed at least two players to be able to talk about strategic interaction. What about the actions? Well, here, according to this description, the actions are Mr. Brown has sort of two levels of a decision process, right? One set of actions is whether to invest on a hedge fund or open a restaurant. And then the second set of actions is whether to open the restaurant in Toronto downtown and Richmond Hill. Obviously, this is somewhat conditional, right? If he decides to invest on hedge fund, Toronto downtown, Richmond Hill, these actions are meaningless. They only make sense if he decides to open a restaurant. For Mr. Green, however, the set of available actions is simpler, right? Because he has just one level of, apparently he's committed to open a restaurant. He doesn't plan to make an investment on hedge fund. Again, this is a simplification assumption. And so his actions are, again, like opening a restaurant in Toronto downtown or Richmond Hill. So the actions are there as well. What about the information? I didn't say anything about it. I will though. All right, so let me leave it here. What about the outcomes? Well, the outcomes are kind of simple. It's the profits, all right? So once you invest on hedge fund, let's suppose he has some expectations of what the future profit will be. And when he decides to open a restaurant in one of those locations, depending on the competition, he has some expectation about what his future profitability or profit will be, all right? So these are sort of the profit is the outcome. And I will sort of specify them. And then the preferences, I didn't completely specify it. I will, though, but sort of mentioned you, right? Remember, I said everybody, both Mr. Brown and Green actually prefers to open a restaurant in Toronto downtown if Mr. Brown decides to open a restaurant, obviously, because Toronto downtown is more profitable. But the thing is, they would like to open up a restaurant in different locations in order not to sort of face with a fierce competition. But I did not really specify what exactly the outcomes are and how each individual ranks those outcomes, which I will. So what we usually do, we don't just leave this game as such. We, as I said, sort of formally write it down. How we do that, we create, what we call game tree. Why do we call it game tree? Well, because as you will see, it looks like a tree. This is why we call it game tree. And so, if you remember the story I told you, that Mr. Brown first kind of makes a decision whether he needs to or he wants to invest on hedge fund or restaurant. Okay? So I'm putting dots here. I'll explain why I do that later. And then if he decides hedge fund, remember I said, the strategic interaction just dies out there. So the strategic interaction, however, continues when he decides to open a restaurant. And so, once again, Mr. Brown, all right, decides whether to open the restaurant downtown or in Richmond Hill. So I'm going to call it RH instead of writing Richmond Hill. And then, whether he decides downtown or Richmond Hill, Mr. Green makes a choice. All right, so this is Mr. Green. This is also Mr. Green. All right, so the Mr. Green, again, decides whether to open a restaurant in downtown or Richmond Hill, and same here, right? Downtown. Let me just say DT or Richmond Hill. All right. So, and let me put more dots here because again, I'm going to give specific names to those. So I'm going to give some names. So this is this point, I'm going to call it A. This I'm going to call it B. This I'm going to call it C. This is going to be D, right? And this is going to be E, F, G, H, and let's call this K. All right. So basically, we can describe this game with this game tree. All right. You may ask, a few questions. Why Mr. Brown is moving first? Why not Mr. Green is kind of moving first? Who determines? Well, obviously, there is, in the story that I told you, there is no sort of clear answer to this. So that was a choice that I made, all right? So I choose that Mr. Brown is making the first choice. But obviously, maybe Mr. Green is already making a move. And then Mr. Brown observes his decision, whether it's the downtown or the Richmond Hill, and then makes a move. So I did not really specify it, but nevertheless, depending on the true story, you can change the order of this play. And so your game tree can actually serve different environments.